Perfect. Now we're going to move on to the dynamic factors of the beach. All this time we were talking about how a beach system works. So essentially, what are the parts of it? And I've left out some things for later. We'll talk about parts of a beach itself. So how a beach would look like and what you can expect by the shore, especially in beach areas as opposed to rocks or coral reefs. So let's move on to this. So this would be understanding the three factors that make the ocean so dynamic, which is waves, currents, and tides. So we'll break these down step by step. The first one would be waves. Okay, great. Waves. Now, in a nutshell, waves are caused by wind, and how it works is larger the distance or larger the interaction of wind with water, which we call fetch. So, greater the fetch, bigger the wave by the shore, provided the right kind of obstacle is there for it to crash, right? So waves. So let's equate that. So that would mean for the wave size to be 1 foot, the fetch has to be at least 100 kilometers in distance. So that means the wind needs to travel 100 kilometers of uninterrupted distance over water for it to generate a 1 foot wave by the shore, right? And waves always crash in shallow zones. So that's the first clue whenever we look out at the beach and we see waves. Waves always break wherever it's shallow. So the wind causes waves, and waves always come in groups. It's generally like your fingers. It'll start with a small wave, medium wave, big wave, medium wave, small wave, and then a pause. And this happens over a period of time. Now, if the wind is generating from a long distance, and let's say there's a cyclone of 800 kilometers off the coast, you can expect the waves to be a lot more bigger by the coast, because it gives it a lot of space to travel uninterrupted. Whereas if there's a cyclone forming just 10 kilometers off the coast, the origin is pushing way too much turbulence to the shore, so you won't really see really nice waves. Now, this is a nice example would be is if you drop a pebble in a well, or if you drop a pebble into a pool or a lake, right? You will see that the ripples evenly distribute over time, like it'll start to widen out and become bigger. It's the same concept here, but the hugest scale ever. So the ripple that you've seen into 1 million would be the swell size that we see in the ocean, right? So they always come in groups. The largest group of waves recorded was off California coast, which was 14 waves in a set. I think this was in 2019. And I think that was really wild. In a place like India, the largest recorded sets that we have seen, given that we have spent over 10 to 11, 12 seasons by the beach, is probably 6 to 8 waves in a set, which is fantastic. But ideally, on an average, it's 3 to 5. I think that's the average everywhere in the world. But these are, special circumstances. So once I show you how to read an app that has got a weather forecast, we'll maybe be able to understand that a little more better, right? So the first part with waves are caused by wind. And keep in mind, these are global winds and not local winds. We have local winds that will affect the condition of the wave as it comes to the shore. And waves are what we call them waves only when they are near shore, right? Before that, they are called swells. So a swell becomes a wave only when it starts to reach the shallow zone. You can see that for yourself. That's when the green wave, so the two kinds of waves, right? The green wave and white wave or white water. So those are the two kinds of waves. And then the actual three types of waves would be the plunging wave, or it's also called dumping wave. Then we have the spilling wave. It's also called a peeling wave. It's in the same category. Then we have a surging wave. Sometimes it's called a resurging wave. So three types of waves. Now even these waves you can see in these type of beaches. For example, surging waves and resurging waves are very common in reflective beach systems, while spilling and peeling waves are super common in dissipative beach systems. And by the name you can see it's spilling, peeling. So this is an ideal condition for surfers. They love a condition like this. And every surfer in the world is chasing for the perfect spot that generates this peeler with the set of this and with the set of the currents and the tide. Like it's the perfect combination. So the right place at the right time. It's like a one in a million moment, you know. Okay, cool. Now let's move on. Waves always generally will tell you where there is an obstacle. So the obstacle is the reason why it's a shallower zone. So here the obstacle can be sand, it can be rocks, it can be reefs, it can be a submerged ship, you know, it can be a submerged island. Anything that is creating an obstruction for the wave to rise and crash is what we're talking about. So every time you see a wave become a green wave furl into white, that zone is the shallowest part of that particular area. That means further than that, so this zone onwards, it starts to get shallow all the way, most likely all the way to the shore. That's another thing we'll talk about with reflective and dissipative beaches, right? Okay, so I think we've got the basics of waves. We'll move on to currents. So currents. If you guys have ever been at the shore, like if you've ever played around in the beach, you would have felt this, the first current. There are generally three types of currents that we look at. And the first one would be something we've always felt. I think we would have felt two currents mainly. The first one would be when you are at the beach, you're standing by the swash zone where we get our feet wet, right? And all that water will climb up, touch your feet, and as it goes down, you'll feel a mild drift going back towards the ocean, right? So that is called an undertow. Now keep in mind, undertows are possibly the most weakest currents among the other three. Like river undertows are way more serious because the thing with the ocean, even during a really big wave and a really slopey beach, right? The wave that hits the shore and climbs up, the water can only go till the point where the water, remaining water is. It cannot physically pull you under. It's impossible. So while the name is very suggestive in a place like this, because of the physics involved, the acceleration is going to take you and you're going to hit the main water and you're going to decelerate to zero, right? And then the next wave is going to smash you back on the shore. I'm sure you guys would have felt this with the undertow. So undertows are no problem, guys. Anytime we'll talk about these with interaction. So we'll talk about what to do when we are facing these things. So this is your undertow, and undertows happen all over the world, wherever it's just a byproduct of gravity, because water that climbs up a slope has to come back, and that movement down the slope because of gravity is basically undertow, right? So here it's of course a natural force, and you don't ever have to worry about undertows. We'll talk about that later. Then the next one would be another current that you would have felt every time you hit the beach is, so every time you go to the beach, you would leave all your things in one particular point and then enter the water, and then 20-30 minutes later, when you look back to the shore, you would have realized that your things are further away, right? You would have entered right by them. So this is a very well-known current called the sweep current. Technical term, longshore drift or littoral current or lateral current. By the names, it's very straightforward. Sweep currents, all they do is take you along the shore. So let's say this, just for reference sake, this is India and Sri Lanka. if direction of sweep on the tip of India is going to be the same on each coast. So that means here the winds that hit is going to start moving the water upwards here, and here the winds that hit is going to start moving the water upwards here. So this is the movement 10 months a year, right? So then the other time the monsoon hits, so northeast winds blow and the current comes this way. But majority of the time on the east coast is up north. So that means from Tamil Nadu you will be going to Andhra Pradesh and then all the way up to Orissa, right? And similarly on this side, west, like Kerala, you will be going all the way up to Gujarat with that littoral current or the lateral current. Lateral currents are generally no problem. All it does is take you along the shore. And we'll talk about exits and what to do when we are in those currents, because sometimes they're really strong, and we are not very wary of what to do when we are in zones like this. The next current is going to be the rip current. And I swear, like, just play. When you put two dots on either side, it sounds like rest in peace current. And a lot of people who get caught in a current like this exaggerate it for that. They tell people, oh man, this place really pulled me out into the ocean and I thought I was done for. And it's a very valid feeling. When you go through that, it's something that you can't explain, and it's something that you are not in control of, so you feel so helpless and you feel a sense of no control, which is the worst scenario, and that creates panic. So you're not really in a state of trying to wonder what to do, you're just trying to fight your way out of that situation. That's generally what happens in a rip. We'll talk about what to do in these currents when we go to that segment. So a rip current is basically okay. Oh right, wait. I'm so sorry. So I've explained to you how an undertow works. It's caused by the wind, by the wave climbing up the shore, and steeper it is, more it climbs, stronger the undertow is. Now sweeps. Let's say this is the shore, right? This is the beach, and this is the ocean. The direction of the wind. Now let's say the wind is blowing straight out in a perpendicular angle. Now for reference, let's say this is the east coast. In fact, let's make it look like the east coast. So east coast, and up is north, right? East, distant referring. So if the wind comes straight like this, during sessions like this, most likely, almost all times, your ratios would be 1:1, because all the water blows straight out to the shore, and the backwash is also at a similar angle. The reason why it's most likely ratio is 1:1 is also because that when the wind hits, particularly like this for East Coast, that means it's the start of the season, probably Jan or Feb, when the easterlies are moving across the globe. So these winds are not as strong. So the water that creates uprush and backwash, this is generally the best time we tell people to come to learn an ocean sport. Because the waves are smaller and the currents are weaker, because it's perpendicular to the shore that it blows, right? So here the sweep is now it's going to start, but it's not going to be very strong. Now as the monsoons, now let's say we're on the east coast of India, okay, let's give it some emphasis. How it works is, in Jan we have the easterly winds, then it starts to angle out. So by Feb, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October. So much that when we are in August, peak season for the east coast of India, the wind that blows the wave to hit the shore climbs up at the same angle and goes back down straight, right? So this is the movement all along the shore. And if this is the east coast of India, right, this is going to be from Kanyakumari all the way to West Bengal. This particular movement is going to create a current that's moving this way, called the lateral current. So what happens is November, December, and the first week of Jan, we have the northeast monsoon. So the wind blows like this, and the entire current gets reversed just for 2 months the entire year. As the same process on the west coast. So that's the movement. Now, this is how a sweep moves, right? So it's directly influenced by the wind and the way the wave climbs at what angle. Angle also is determinant in this area, because if it's going to be a day like this, like March, April, May, it's not going to be as strong. But August, September, you're going to expect the waves to like literally climb up sideways, and the waves are also huge. We expect like 10 to 12 feet waves at around this time of the year, and it's season for us, right? It's the waves are a lot of fun. It's not as fun for swimmers who are just starting out because the waves are huge and the currents are really moving us about. But when you get used to it, it's a really nice place to be in the water because it's just fun. I don't know how to explain it. Okay, let's just move on. Now we're going to talk about the rip current in this scenario. Okay, so let's watch how a rip would work. Generally, what happens is along the coast, where there is where the shore is, the the sand. This is the shore, right? This is the ocean. The sand is generally undernuated. That means it's like it's deep and shallow in a few inches all over the place. You would have felt it when you're walking along the shore. You'll walk and suddenly one small pit will come and then you'll walk back again, right? So these undernuations along the shore generally offer lesser resistance. So that means when the wind is really intense, like August, September, when the waves are bigger, the currents are stronger, when the uprush general and backwash ratio is maybe 4:1, which itself is enough for us to know that we are going to have the rip current. So all the water that climbs up is not able to drain as fast because gravity pulls only at a constant, and the remaining wind is pushing it a lot faster and further up the shore. So it's in nature to remain in equilibrium. So this water along the shore finds a way out, and these pits in the undernuations form lesser resistance. So it might find this pit and start to drain. Now over time, on the shore, what was 2 feet here, 2 feet here, this place has now become 3 feet because all that water has drained the sand. Deeper zone is formed because of all the water moving out, and all this sand accumulates at this spot, right? So this water is moving out. The moment it hits this zone, starts to weaken, and it will form mushroom cloud patterns. This is how you spot a rip from the shore, right? So it will literally look like a mushroom, and it will look like a space where you have so it how a rip zone would be is also like a vein, or narrower channels means the water will move out faster, broader channels means the water will move slow, right? So narrow channel rips are generally what we see in India especially, and they're all temporary rips. So we'll talk about the types of rips in a second. Now this is how a general rip works. There is something called a permanent rip, which is always there. By an ideal example would be where the river meets the ocean. So that delta where that river water flows out into sea, that place is generally very deep. How deep? It's probably 5 feet to 6 feet onwards, right by that river mouth, right? So there it's quite deep. But what happens is the moment this stops, all the sand will fill it up and these zones disappear. It's the same thing here. So this forms only because there is a need for equilibrium, so it is arise. Now once all this water has found a way to exit, the channel immediately starts to reduce, and if the wind is also reduced, this will be covered by the sand and the rip disappears. This is how a temporary rip forms, right? So if you can realize, it's just because of the need for a rip that a rip forms. Okay, I'm running out of space. We were talking about rips. So there are technically 11 to 12 kinds of rips that is coined by this really awesome company in New Zealand. I keep forgetting the name. they have termed rips into 11 kinds of rips plus an extra one that they discovered later. But honestly, man, let's just keep it simple. Rips can be of three types. The first one would be, I think it would be called a hydrodynamic rip. So this means water on water interaction. That's it. So just the way water travels sometimes, like we spoke about this, choosing least path of resistance type of thing. Then we have a rips, which means that the rips are formed because of the area, like because of the topography or the geography. So that's a bathymetry rip. And the third one, I think it's called a boundary rip. So boundary rips are what you find when there are piers or rocks set up inside the ocean. So if you go to Kovalam, you'll find a lot of rocks, and you'll see that the beach on this side is so much more different than the beach on that side. In fact, the beach will be here somewhere compared to the beach on this side, right? So that's a boundary rip. So that means the water that hits here will shoot out super fast, and then the sweep will start again very slowly here, right? So that's the kind of rip that we talk about when it comes to boundary. Then we have the which we were talking about, the temporary and the permanent rips. Like these can form either or, and I think we have covered rips. Let's talk about tides. So that means we have the earth, and we have the moon, and we have the sun. Sun I'm drawing small because it's relatively further away from the moon. So what happens is, the you understand when anything occupies time and space, it attracts one another. I think that's one of the laws. So in that instance, when you look at heavenly bodies such as the earth, sun, and the moon, the sun has done a phenomenal job with the whole time and space and attraction, because it's got a solar system around it. So it's keeping that in check. And then the earth is doing a good job holding on to a moon that also revolves around it. Now the moon is going to try and do something similar, right? In fact, let's just say moon and earth, sun, in fact, what happens with a lot of asteroids that go by is that every time it passes by the moon's attraction pulls the asteroid to it, and which is what we see as craters on the moon, right? Because moon doesn't have an atmosphere, whereas the earth, we have a very equal or similar amounts of asteroids and debris falling on the earth, but we have a huge atmosphere. In fact, there was a very interesting study that said that every time you leave your car overnight, and over 14 hours of dust collected overnight, 40% is stardust. That means 40% of the dust accumulated on your car is coming from the universe. And I think that's really wild, right? So the Earth's atmosphere does a great job in like arresting all the debris that visit the Earth. But now what happens is, given that the moon is always in constant proximity with the Earth, the moon is going to try and develop some kind of physical force, exert some kind of physical force on it. So what happens is, the moon starts to try and attract the Earth. In fact, the Earth is way too big that it cannot be attracted towards the moon, right? The Earth is holding the moon in check. And when we think about how big, I think in 1700s or 1600s, there was a theory that when the Earth was forming, a large chunk of the Earth broke, and that became the moon, and this is what we call the Pacific Ocean. But this was later disproved because the sediments here and the sediments here didn't correlate, especially when we went to the moon and came back, right? But that's an interesting analogy. Like, imagine we can actually fit the moon into the Earth. So moon being such a large body is trying to attract the Earth. Earth being too big cannot be attracted. But we have the hydrosphere, which compromises of a lot of water, like 75% of the earth is water. So what happens is the water sphere will start to bulge towards the moon, right? And given that this, and you should remember, this is a 3D diagram, I can only draw it 2D, but the earth, since it starts to revolve on its axis, develops a centripetal force that gives it an equal and opposite reaction on the back. So there are two bulges. Now, the sun also actually exerts a force. In fact, because of the sun, there is a primary bulge that is always just bigger near the sun than the moon or any other part, right? And it will have a smaller bulge at the back. But so what happens is, now forget the sun. The sun is already doing its whole tidal thing. We are affected more by the moon. So the tide, every time the moon shifts direction, so let's say every, I think it is 5 hours 37 minutes or something, it changes 1 quarter, right? So every quarter, now in 4 quarters, it's covered 24 hours, almost 24 hours, right? So that means if you are standing here and during 6 a.m. it's high tide, because the moon is right there and the gravitation force is exerted towards the moon, in 5 hours 37 minutes, or let's just approximately say for this argument 6 hours, the moon would have hit the next quarter, and this place will now experience low tide because the moon is now here, and regardless of where the sun is, this is now the moon. So all the water is reduced on this side and this side, and it starts to bulge this side because that moon is now here, right? So again, once the moon moves here, you'll have the bulge forms here, the bulge forms there, and it flattens on this side. You will still experience high tide, right? So that means we experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. Now most of the time the 1 high tide and 1 low tide is towards the night, but if you stay long enough on the beach, you would maybe not be available for only 1 tide of that event. You'll be there for the other 3 tides. So this is how tides work, okay? I really hope I did justice to that. But now let's understand spring tide and neap tide. When we look at something called a spring tide, spring tide happens when the earth and moon are directly aligned with the sun. So that the sun is here or the sun is here, and it creates what is called like a super tide. So it happens twice a month. So spring tide and then neap tide, where the sun is either in 90 degrees to the moon, right here or here. The tides generated would kind of cancel each other out. So the difference is only about 1.5 feet to 3 feet. In a place like India, the tidal difference in a coast of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and most of the eastern coast and the western southern tips is only 3 to 4 feet. Whereas when you climb up to the Gulf of Kutch, if you go to a place like near Diu in Gujarat, the tide line can be up to 21 feet. So that's where the water really flows into land, right? You can cross certain areas only during certain times of the day during tide. So that's how much a tide can impact.